welcome to week 11's lectures on Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. In today's lecture session, I will introduce the author, Oscar Wilde, talk a little bit about his personal and literary context, and offer you a brief summary of the plot of the novel. Oscar Wilde's full name is Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde. He was born on October 16th, 1854 in Dublin, Ireland, and he died on 30th November 1900 in Paris, which is in France. He was an Irish wit, poet, dramatist whose reputation rests on his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and on his comic masterpieces, Lady Windermere's Fan and The Importance of Being Earnest. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel which is interesting to us in terms of its Gothic mode. Whereas Lady Windermere's Fan and The Importance of Being Earnest are plays, and they're considered to be his comic masterpieces which satirize late Victorian society and its hypocrisies. Oscar Wilde was a spokesman for the late 19th century aesthetic movement in England, which advocated art for art's sake, and he was the object of celebrated civil and criminal suits involving homosexuality and ending in his imprisonment. Oscar Wilde is famous for being a symbol of the aesthetic movement at the turn of the century in England, and the aesthetic movement had at its heart this credo, that is, art should be for art's sake. There's no apparent social purpose which should inform a particular art when it is being structured and disseminated and enjoyed. So the most important facet of a literary work is its aesthetic elements, its formal pleasures, the way it has been constructed and structured. Oscar Wilde was deeply impressed by the teachings of the English writers John Ruskin and Walter Pater, and with regard to these two writers, what was important was the significance of art in life, and particularly by Pater's stress on the aesthetic intensity by which life should be lived. Like many in his generation, Wilde was determined to follow Pater's urging to burn always with a hard, gem-like flame. But Wilde also delighted in affecting an aesthetic pose. This, combined with rooms at Oxford decorated with objets d'art, resulted in his famous remark, "Oh, would that I could live up to my blue china." As I pointed out just now, Oscar Wilde was greatly influenced by the great artists John Ruskin and Walter Pater, especially by Pater's emphasis on the intense aesthetic life. And it's very interesting to see this analogy of life to a gem-like flame, and Wilde wanted to imitate that kind of intense life which is very attractive, which is fire-like, which is like a precious stone that is burning. So life should be like that according to Wilde. And the last remark there on the slide by Wilde, that he desires to live up to his very beautiful blue china. He desires to live up to the beauties of a particular object, is telling in the guidelines about life that Oscar Wilde adhered to. In the early 1880s, when aestheticism was the rage and despair of literary London, Wilde established himself in social and artistic circles by his wit and flamboyance. Soon the periodical Punch made him the satiric object of its antagonism to the aesthetes for what was considered their unmasculine devotion to art. And in their comic opera Patience, Gilbert and Sullivan based the character Bunthorne, a fleshly poet, partly on Wilde. Wishing to reinforce the association, Wilde published at his own expense poems, which came out in 1881, which echoed too faithfully his discipleship to the poets Algernon Swinburne, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and John Keats. Now, there are several points in this set of ideas which are very important in understanding the context to which Wilde belonged. Firstly, the idea of aestheticism in literature was both popular and at the same time was decried by social and literary commentators. And Wilde became one of the key members of the artistic circles because of his ability to be very, very attractively satirical, and he was also very flamboyant. He dressed and spoke in a showy manner. There was an element of dandyism, and Oscar Wilde's demeanor was picked up by the periodical press, and Punch made fun of him as well as the aesthetes, because Punch thought this kind of artistic tendency, the aesthetic artistic tendency, was unmasculine. This kind of art was not very masculine. There was a feminine subtext to it, and Wilde was at the receiving end of this satirical representation of Punch, and Wilde responded to it by emphasizing the beauties of nature in his poetry in the fashion of Swinburne and Rossetti and Keats. So Wilde re-emphasized and reiterated his joy in celebrating the fleshly side of nature. Wilde was a reviewer for the Pall Mall Gazette and then became editor of Woman's World, which was published between 1887 and 1889 under his editorship. During this period of apprenticeship as a writer, he published The Happy Prince and Other Tales, which came out in 1888, which reveals his gift for romantic allegory in the form of the fairy tale. In this particular collection, The Happy Prince and Other Tales, which was immensely popular and continues to be immensely popular to this day, one can see the gift of Oscar Wilde in combining allegory with a fairy tale narrative. So there's a lot of irony, allegory, satire, and romance in these tales, and they have a moral purpose as well. In the final decade of his life, Wilde wrote and published nearly all of his major work. In his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, published in Lippincott's magazine 1890, and in book form revised and expanded by 6 chapters, that came out in 1891, Wilde combined the supernatural elements of the Gothic novel with the unspeakable sins of French decadent fiction. Critics charge immorality despite Dorian's self-destruction. Wilde, however, insisted on the amoral nature of art regardless of an apparently moral ending. Wilde, especially in the final years of his life, in the final decade, he wrote and published. He brought his work out himself. He financed his work. He published his own work. And in the Picture of Dorian Gray, which sorry for that Freudian slip. In the Picture of Dorian Gray, which was initially published in Lippincott's magazine in 1890, was expanded. Wilde added a couple of chapters, and it came out as a novel book form in 1891. In terms of its form, it's very interesting because it combines the Gothic mode with the French decadent fiction type of narrative. So there is a hybrid tone to this novel, and this novel was condemned by critics who argued that this was an immoral book. Interestingly, Wilde argued that art is amoral. It doesn't have a message to communicate to its readers. Art is art. Art for art's own sake is what Wilde believed in. Despite this kind of claim, one can see that the novel is moralistic in tone. Dorian self-destructs. He finds that he has to pay for his crimes, and that can be seen as a moral way in which the novel is structured. But despite this kind of structuring, critics attack this novel for its apparent immorality. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a moral fantasy novel. There are elements of the fantastic in this work, and as I pointed out, it was published in Lippincott's monthly magazine and turned into a novel form in the year 1891. The novel, the only one by Wilde, had 6 additional chapters when it was released as a book in 1891. The work, an archetypal tale of a young man who purchases eternal youth at the expense of his soul, was a romantic exposition of Wilde's own aestheticism. At the heart of the Picture of Dorian Gray, there is a young man, and the young man can be an archetype for anyone who wants to remain youthful forever. And for that kind of bargain, this young man sells his soul, and this is a reflection of Wilde's own aesthetic philosophy. The story begins in the art studio of Basil Hallward, who is discussing a current painting with his witty and amoral friend, Lord Henry Wotton. Henry thinks that the painting, a portrait of an extraordinarily beautiful young man, should be displayed, but Basil disagrees, fearing that his obsession with the portrait subject, Dorian Gray, can be seen in the work. The setting is interesting. It's in an art studio, and there is a conversation between Lord Henry Wotton and Basil Hallward, who's an artist. Henry thinks that this painting should be displayed, but Henry Wotton thinks that this painting should be displayed, but Basil thinks that it is a personal project. Dorian then arrives, and he's fascinated as Henry explains his belief that one should live life to the fullest by indulging one's impulses. Henry also points out that beauty and youth are fleeting, and Dorian declares that he would give his soul if the portrait were to grow old and wrinkled while he remained young and handsome. Basil gives the painting to Dorian. We can very clearly see that Henry is laying out the philosophy of indulgence. Live life to the full. That seems to be his credo, and one can see that Dorian is becoming very quickly influenced by Henry's philosophy. Henry's point that beauty and youth are fleeting, they're ephemeral, and Dorian immediately points out, declares that if he could retain his youth, and if the portrait can age, if the portrait of his figure could age, then he would easily sell his soul to get that kind of deal. And Basil ends up giving the portrait to Dorian. Henry decides to take on the project of molding Dorian's personality. A few weeks later, Dorian tells Henry that he has fallen in love with an actress, Sybil Vane, because of her great beauty and acting talent. Henry and Basil go with him to a dingy theatre to see Sybil, but her performance is terrible. Sybil explains to Dorian that now that she knows what real love is, she can no longer pretend to be in love on stage. Dorian is repulsed and wants nothing further to do with her. Dorian is taken under the wing of Henry. Henry becomes the guide and friend and philosopher of Dorian, and a few weeks later, Dorian informs his friend that he is in love with an actress called Sybil Vane, who's very beautiful and apparently has a lot of acting talent. And the friends, including Henry and Basil, go with Dorian, and they witness the performance of Sybil, who is terrible on the stage. And Sybil informs Dorian that she cannot pretend to be in love with anyone else on the stage. She cannot express or pretend affection on stage because she knows what real love is. Dorian is disgusted with Sybil and he breaks off with her. When he returns home, he sees a cruel expression on the face of his portrait, and he decides to seek Sybil's forgiveness. Henry arrives the next day, however, with news that Sybil committed suicide the previous night, and he convinces Dorian that there is no reason for him to feel badly about it. We can see how things take a turn for the worse very quickly. Dorian's cruel rejection ends in Sybil's suicide, and Dorian is able to feel repentance only when he sees his cruelty depicted for him on the face of his portrait. That is very interesting. He's able to look at how he would have appeared to Sybil by looking at the portrait, and he decides to ask her forgiveness, but it's too late. Henry informs him the next day that Sybil is no more, and Henry also offers comfort and solace to Dorian, saying that there is no need to feel guilty about it, no need to feel bad about it. So one can also see that Henry is not a great advisor of Dorian. So he seems to be Dorian's bad angel. Dorian has the portrait removed to his attic. Henry sends Dorian a book that he finds poisonous and fascinating. Critics have suggested that it might be Against the Grain by Joris Karl Huysmans. Under the book's influence, Dorian spent the next 18 years in the pursuit of capricious and cybernetic excess, and he becomes increasingly drawn to evil. He frequently visits the portrait, noting the signs of aging and of corruption that appear, though he himself remains unblemished. Dorian becomes uncomfortable with this changing portrait, this magical Gothic portrait of his own face, and he gets it removed and kept in the attic of his home. The evil angel, Henry Wotton, sends Dorian an important object. It's a poisonous and fascinating book by Joris Karl Huysmans, and it is titled Against the Grain. This book is hugely influential, and it makes Dorian spend the next 18 years, nearly 2 decades, in the pursuit of pleasure. He is extremely indulgent in sensual pleasures, and one can see that he is drawn to the evil side than to the good. Dorian is curious to see how the portrait changes, and he notices that the portrait ages and there is corruption writ large on his face in the portrait, but he himself, his own body and appearance, his own face is spotless. It remains as youthful and as handsome as ever. One evening, he runs into Basil, who tells him that there are rumors that he has destroyed the lives and reputations of many people. Dorian, however, refuses to accept blame. Basil declares that he clearly does not know Dorian, who responds by taking him to the attic to see the portrait. The painting has become horrifying. Basil tells Dorian that if this is a reflection of his soul, he must repent and pray for forgiveness. And a suddenly enraged Dorian murders Basil. He blackmails another former friend into disposing of the body. Once again, you can see how gruesome Dorian Gray behaves when he is forced to face the truth. Basil, his old friend, informs Dorian that he has a bad reputation because people talk behind his back, the back of Dorian, and say that he had spoiled the reputations of several people, and Basil is at a loss to understand the behavior of Dorian. Dorian takes him to the attic and shows him the portrait, and the portrait is ugly to look at. The painting is a thing of horror. It becomes a Gothic object, and Basil very quickly reads the lesson there. It's an easy lesson, and he tells Dorian that he has to beg for forgiveness because the portrait represents his soul, his horrible soul, and Dorian is unable to bear that kind of judgment, and he in an impulse murders Basil and gets rid of his body with the help of another former friend. Dorian goes to an opium den where Sybil's vengeful brother James finds him, but the fact that Dorian still appears quite young dissuades him from acting. However, another patron of the den later divulges Dorian's age. At a subsequent hunting party at Dorian's country estate, one of the hunters accidentally shoots and kills James, who was hiding in a thicket. So James is the brother of Sybil, and he wants to take revenge on Dorian for his appalling behavior towards Sybil. Everyone is at a loss as to how Dorian is still so young, and so is James. He's also confused that Dorian is youthful. He comes to learn about his real age from another member of the den, and at a shooting party organized by Dorian, James is very conveniently killed off. Somebody accidentally kills James when he was hiding in a thicket. Some weeks later, Dorian tells Henry that he has decided to become virtuous and recently decided against taking advantage of a young girl who is smitten with him. Dorian goes to see if the portrait has improved because of his honorable act, but he sees rather that it has acquired a look of cunning. He decides to destroy the portrait and stabs it with a knife. His servants hear a scream, and when they arrive, they see a loathsome old man dead on the floor with a knife in his chest and a portrait of the beautiful young man he once was. Towards the end of the novel, we see Dorian informing Henry that he is going to change for the better and that he is not going to take advantage of a young girl. He's not going to spoil her faith in him. And once he makes this decision, he goes to check if the portrait has gotten better because of this good deed of not taking advantage of an impressionable young girl. But when he looks at the portrait, he sees an appearance of cunning on his face. His portrait looks very, very crafty, and Dorian is unable to bear this kind of expression anymore, and he decides to destroy the portrait. He stabs it with a knife, and there's a lot of screaming which is heard by his servants, and when they come to find out, they find a dead man, an old man who's dead on the floor with that knife in his chest. The old man is dead and the portrait becomes young. Dorian regains his old age. The corrupt old body is what is lying on the floor, motionless and lifeless, and the portrait, which was really ugly looking, has become beautiful and youthful looking. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book, wrote Wilde. Books are well written or badly written, that's all. The aphorisms that make up the preface of Wilde's novel were his response to those critics who had denounced the immorality and unhealthiness of this story after its scandalous first appearance in Lippincott's monthly magazine. However, for all its transgressive delights, The Picture of Dorian Gray could easily be read as a profoundly moral book, even a cautionary tale against the dangers of vice. According to Oscar Wilde, there is no such thing as an immoral book. Books can only be well written or very poorly written, badly constructed, that's it. These are some of the aphorisms that one can find in the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray. And though the book was denounced, put down, and criticized for its immorality and unhealthiness, they thought this was not a suitable book to be read by the society. Despite all this kind of fears and worries, one can easily see that The Picture of Dorian Gray is a moral book. In fact, one can also see it as a cautionary tale of Oscar Wilde, who is warning the readers against the dangers of evil, of sensual pleasure, of excessive indulgence in pleasures of many kinds. So what is interesting is that despite its morality, it was condemned as an immoral book. Thank you for watching. I'll continue in the next session.